So welcome to this third installment of our study of the great medicine that conquers clinging to the notion of reality, steps in meditation on the enlightened mind. So we've so far covered how to attend this teaching in the sense that we I guess first of all, what's really essential is some humble recognition that we need medicine. You could say studying Buddhism is not really something we do to enhance our, you could say, brilliance, but it's rather a necessary step as a remedy for our suffering. So we can't really, as Trungpa Rinpoche, he used to make a point about, we can't really operate with the Dharma as a means for gaining further credentials. We are attending this or approaching this study with the sense that this is something that could help us. We're a bit like a patient, and this is the medicine, the Buddha, the great physician. And our practice of the path is then going to be the course of remedy, the treatment. So as we're studying this, we'd want to be clear on the value of this and also listen without being too distracted. Of course, we have the recordings, so that might help some of it. But anyway, we'd also want to recognize the universal value of this. So we're not just doing this merely for our own sake, but really with an understanding that this could really help everyone, everywhere. So in the previous chapters, we discussed also the basic condition that underlies this entire project, what we call Buddha nature, how this is overlooked and how we have delusion, and hence we wander in samsara. And then recognizing that presently we have a unique opportunity, we then engage in the path through the what we call the gateway to the Buddhist teaching, which is taking refuge. And the main practice really of the teaching is this developing the awakened mind, the development of bodhicitta. So we discussed that last time. And this time we're going to be looking at how this translates into facing what trips us, our obstacles, and also how to, you could say, engender a greater space of mind, and how to actually cultivate this bodhicitta, enhancing it through the practice of what we call sending and taking. Sending our happiness to others and taking upon ourselves the suffering of others, basically reversing the counterproductive logic of our ignorance or ego. So welcome to, I'm going to cut the video, and so the first verse in chapter 5 on how to overcome obstacles, it runs, first we cling to the notion of I, then to the notion of mine. I bow to the great compassionate one who has compassion for all those beings who because of this clinging circle up and down in samsara as in a watermill. So ignorantly we fixate on a self as truly existent. This brings about other. On this basis we have the other as objects, situations, etc. that we like or dislike. These reactionary patterns all originate on the basis of fixating on the non-existent self. From here we continually suffer. This is what the compassionate Buddha is concerned about. So like Rabjam Rinpoche says, samsara begins when we delineate something as the self and grasp it as a truly existent entity. Obviously, positing an I then brings the other, that which is not the I. As a result we begin to differentiate between things, objects, possessions, that which is yours and mine, and so on, creating the duality of samsara and its subsequent suffering. So we're not at any moment talking about all of a sudden everything should go away. We're not talking about the fact that we cognize, that we're conscious, that this is synonymous with me. What we're talking about is that this cognition ends up being centered around myself and blind to others. So you could say it's a narrow state of mind. And that's what we're addressing. As we all notice that when we're a bit flexible, less narrow, there's less suffering. And when we are more uptight, then there's more suffering. So we're not talking about, you could say, removing any aspects of our reality. We're really just speaking about, say, removing the limitations we have to our reality. Now, a great compassionate one is someone who has achieved perfect understanding of the non-dual nature of reality cannot help but feel immense compassion for those who have fallen into this dualistic frame of mind. It's important that we realize in addressing this thing of clinging to the self that we're not talking moralism. We're not talking about some absolute standard for how we ought to be. As far as causes and conditions go, we are free to cling to the self. We just suffer as a consequence. This is not about punishment. This is just about cause and effect. We're free to eat junk food. We're free to subscribe to a self, but we should be aware of these consequences. And this is then where the great physician, the Buddha, he cares for our happiness and advises us what to do. In addressing the causes of suffering, then the text here goes on to identify where we're creating its causes. But we're merely saying that we shouldn't eat junk food, we shouldn't cling to the self. It's just awareness of cause and effect. So we're concerned about this circling around a self, which essentially is constructed through a delusion, through ignorance. And that this is where we're going to look at what's going on. We want to see how we get entangled in these patterns of self in order to avoid being caught. So this is then where we're going to be looking at how this self operates. Although I have not done it the slightest harm, my enemy, ego clinging, has entrenched itself in my heart since beginningless time and confined me to the appalling prison of existence. So you could say, while ordinary friends can be dealt with, that's a mistake. That's supposed to say enemy. So while ordinary enemies can be dealt with, well, sometimes you do have friends that leave you, how do you say, without any need for enemies. But then again, what's clear here is that these unwanted associates, then they can be dealt with. And also at one point they could well cease to be our enemies. However, the ego clinging never ceases to torture us. The curious thing is we never give up ego clinging. So the point here is we now need to do something. So we want to recognize how enemies eventually change into friends, and they can be handled, but this self is not like that. This is the constant single cause of our ongoing suffering. We can say that we're innocent, and yet this delusion continually brings down harm on us. It never rests, and we say that it sits at the heart of our experience, torturing us without respite. And we gullibly never relinquish or doubt its existence. So we need to think about this. And once we realize the nature of this situation, we need to do something. It has inflicted hundreds of tortures upon me. Yet, instead of resenting it, I have put my trust in it and fallen under its power. Is there any catastrophe, any delusion worse than this? So we need to be determined. In eliminating this, we need to undermine this deluded notion of a self. As Rabjam Rinpoche says, the time is ripe to take action against ego clinging. One way to free yourself from this enemy is to attack the notion of self and the afflicting mental states it engenders. So in view of this being a serious situation, of course, possibly we might just suffer from a few manageable catastrophes and pains. But if we look in the world, there's a lot of suffering. And also, like I've mentioned a few times, and what's implicit in what we're talking about here is that as long as this delusion hasn't been dealt with, this follows us lifetime after lifetime, moment after moment. So misplaced patience is contemptible. Taking the 3 jewels as my support, mounting the horse of irrevocable renunciation, donning the armor of the 4 boundless ones, and rallying the armies of the 6 paramitas. Today, with the sharp weapons of emptiness and compassion, I shall slay my foe. So this is a moment of crisis, and as such, we need to treat this as a very unwanted situation in which there is something that we can identify as the culprit, namely our ignorance, and this needs to be addressed. The Buddha is our guide, the Dharma is the path, the Sangha is our fellow warriors. Our horse is determination to be free, what we very often call renunciation, but renunciation shouldn't be really seen as just running away from it all. It really, Ngenjung in Tibetan, literally means to arrive at certainty. So the certainty is about this project of liberation, that we're determined to be free. So as we do this, then we have 4 immeasurables that are antidotes to this clinging to the self on a conventional level, you could say. And that is the loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Our troops are the 6 paramitas: generosity, patience, discipline, diligence or energy, vigor, concentration, and finally, what really is the greatest of these is wisdom. And if we have these, then we have both what we could call relative and absolute methods. And we are invincible. We possess the greatest weapon of all, which is this emptiness. You could say the absolute realization that is free from clinging to the self, and hence you could say all the neurotic pain caught up in sustaining the ego being liberated, manifesting as love, is then the nature of this realization. You could say compassion is the nature of the realization of emptiness. So this is the greatest weapon of all. Of course, we're just talking a metaphor here, metaphor of war, but we are, you could say, dealing with something that imposes tremendous pain. If I do not destroy ego clinging, it will continue to generate the endless torments of the hell without respite and others. What sane being would fail to take action? So failure to address this leaves us open to any kind of delusion. It needs to be destroyed now. It leaves us vulnerable to any kind of, you could say, delusional self-imprisonment. And this also includes the experience of the most painful of all styles of self-imprisonment, which is aggression, which is experienced on a subjective level as, you could say, alienation to the other, hatred for the other, and on the objective level, the environment rising up as a place that, you could say, perpetuates this vicious cycle of pain and aggression. This is what we call hell. So in that it perpetuates itself, we sometimes refer to this as hell without respite. It doesn't mean that it's absolute, but as long as the causes and conditions haven't exhausted, it goes on. So from this point of view, it's obvious that we need to do something. And if we fail to do something now, this would be the cause of immense regret. And this is why we look at the lives of great saints and great masters. This is why they made this the path of liberation such a priority. So the good news is that this is a delusion. This is a paper tiger. This is something that disappears if we actually look. We famously have the image of the rope that is misperceived as a snake, and all it requires for the snake to go away is that we actually look, that we investigate. So we say, examine where the nature of the self remains and goes to. You will discover that it does not possess the slightest shred of existence. It is an enemy that, once subdued, will never arise again. So we need to address this naive belief, and we do this through investigation. We assume that there's a true existence of a self, and this comes about, our perception comes about simply from not looking properly. Now, this is something that we'd want to particularly appreciate on the backdrop of Western phenomenology or psychology, where we basically operate with the self as a given. This is not at all the case in the Buddha's teaching. Here, and what the Buddha observed is that this self is a hoax. It's something non-existent that we take as existent. So this delusion is the cause of suffering. So, of course, we're not, you could say, denying a lot of what, of course, the logic of Western psychology, which is creating also causes for happiness and dealing with causes for happiness. But there is still the assumption that there's an underlying self that we're, you could say, caring for or helping or assisting. So the notion of non-self is not really part of the sort of existing discourse in Western understanding of the mind. So as a result of this sense of me, then we have my body, my mind. And the implication is that there is some distinct self that then owns these as objects. So that self then, where is it? Rabjam Rinpoche says, when we investigate like this, we find that the self is just a concept. But where does this concept come from? Where does the self dwell, if it is the consciousness that is present in our mind? Where does it go when it leaves? What happens to the self between past and future thoughts? Does the self dwell between these two things that do not exist? How can the present thought of a self exist as something? So we're basically just through analyzing this, we won't find anything. We might sometimes be a little bit baffled by some of these styles of analysis, and we think in terms of our past, we think in terms of our present and future. But actually, if we look, then there is actually nothing that is solidly there. There's continual shifting conditions. And so we say that a bit like actually Heraclitus, he would say, our consciousness is like a stream. So famously, Heraclitus said, no man ever steps in the same river twice. Everything is in flux. And so there is no self from the side of the river. The river doesn't think, I am the river. River is a label we attribute to something that appears as a solid stream. So likewise, through investigation, very simply, we can liberate ourselves from this assumption. And this is quite helpful, particularly for us in the context of modernity, where we're very often used to something like this, metaphysical or unseen and intangible, has to be embraced on the basis of faith. But that's not at all the case. What we are applying here, you could say, is kind of enhanced empiricism, where we look introspectively at the mind, and this is completely valid. And this is where we then can establish this lack of any solid self. The thing is, as far as us sort of modern folk go, and this actually would include modern Tibetans, Bhutanese, Indians, what have you, Chinese, that it's a very different position than it was in traditional Asian societies, because our accepted sciences, then, like I mentioned before, they actually say there is a self. And the accepted sciences in old Buddhist cultures said that there is no self. So as modern people, actually, we have to make a choice who to believe, the ancients or, the people at MIT or Stanford or what have you. Of course, nowadays, in these particularly, you could say, advanced institutions of learning, there's a lot of understanding of the constructed nature of our ideas around self and so forth. We have mindfulness, we have compassion research. So this is complex, but there's a lot of modern discourse that really doesn't accommodate this understanding of no self. So for us who are engaging in the path, it's actually very valuable to use this Madhyamika or middle way reasoning. And even in Buddhism, traditionally, we actually say that what we call the valid cognition based on either direct or inferential logic, it actually is more important than the authority that we have from the scriptures. So our own reflection actually and our own valid cognition is actually seen to be more important than we find it in the scriptures. This we have from Dharmakirti. In the past, the sublime heroic bodhisattvas achieved bliss by conquering this very enemy. Knowing the risks and benefits that are at stake, one who does not let this enemy escape is the wisest of the wise, the bravest of the brave. Who can equal such a one? So we're following the examples of the great bodhisattvas. Once we see through the deception of a self, it ceases to be a threat. This is the victory of the bodhisattvas, and as much as this might be understood in the present context as something that is easy, is clear, we habitually have the patterns of obscurations, afflictive emotions, and so forth that we continually fall into. So we fall under the power of this deception. But again, if we look, it ceases to be a threat. And seeing through this deception, there's nothing greater. The result of this we can see in the greatness of the bodhisattvas. We can see it in the stories of the great bodhisattvas of the past, in the examples of the bodhisattvas that we possibly could encounter in the present. And we all intuitively appreciate the value of this. So the implication of what we're doing here is that we are doing just that. We are following their example. The wise victorious ones expounded 84,000 teachings to subdue ego clinging, tailored to the faculties of every being to be taught. All are for the single purpose of taming self-clinging. Depending on the level of one's intelligence, the obscuring emotions can be eradicated, transformed, or utilized. Yet in essence, the root of all these is the supreme training, bodhicitta. So we want to have a sense that all of the entire Buddhist project, if you like, has one single objective, which is taming the self. And we can do this in various ways that all reflect this practice of bodhicitta. So a single objective of all the Buddha's teachings, awakening from delusion of self. Many different individual needs and afflictive emotions, so many different remedies. 3 ways according to the various levels, jhanas, We associate with the Hinayana antidotes aimed at eliminating the afflictive emotions. And this applies to everybody. Everybody needs to have that. Transforming the afflictive emotions, this is the scope of experienced practitioners. And afflictive emotions as the path, that's for those who have a lot of experience and skill. Persons with what Rabjam Rinpoche refers to as higher acumen and prowess. So Rabjam Rinpoche here, he says, all aspects of the Buddha's teachings target the eradication of clinging to the notion of self and reality. So we have many different styles of confusion, many different styles of self-imprisonment, and hence numerous teachings. Now, we have actually in the Vinaya a place where it says that the teachings will adapt according to time and place. So in addition to what we call the 84,000 teachings, we can also see how we have various Buddhisms in various cultures. But here we're going to look at then how the clinging to the self, and as a result of clinging to the self, the afflictive emotions, how these can then be dealt with in 3 different ways. So this is now very practical. How is one to practice? Not allowing free rein to ordinary thoughts that fabricate samsara. Master them with mindfulness. Recollect all your past anger and completely crush it with the army of the antidotes. This is giving up the obscuring emotions. So this is just the first approach, how to apply antidotes. We recognize how much, you could say, these armies of afflicting emotions and so forth, the kleshas, they have created, how much they have created of suffering for us. And so we're a bit someone who is continually disturbed by these. It's a bit like we're caught in a storm. Many of us take this for granted, and of course in modernity sometimes we even refer to this as the spice of life. But again, even when we have these very colorful, vivid, highly intelligent bouts of strong emotions, we'd actually like to be a bit in control, and we essentially subscribe to them because we hope somehow they would lead to some gratification or something wonderful. But at the end of the day, anything unwanted, nobody wants that. So we'd want to be quite aware of what's happening within ourselves, and we'd want to see what is really what disturbs us. And when we're disturbed, then we very often, our actions are driven by this disturbance. So it's as if we're a bit gullibly entangled by these afflictive emotions. And as soon as we begin to really get caught in them, then we actually give them a lot of strength. So what really is what really is implicit here is we don't want to be fooled anymore. We reflect how these kleshas, these afflictive emotions, have harmed us in the past. And we'd want to proceed then dealing with these skillfully. Not just sort of a moment of never gonna be angry again or whatever, but we actually want to be clear, just like we would attack an enemy. And we notice that when thoughts arise, then very often we just gullibly follow after them and they proliferate. So we'd want to put an end to that. So we could apply in terms of just post-meditation and our ordinary experience when we have attachment, aversion, and so forth, that we apply various antidotes that then eliminate our fascination with these objects. For example, in the case of attachment, we could focus on the lack of appeal of the object. In the case of objects of anger, we could actually shift out of the anger and cultivate loving kindness. And we generally say for ignorance, just simple-minded, stubborn, lazy judgment, that we could alleviate that with reflecting on complexity or dependent arising, that things don't just exist solidly as we judge them as, but they're conditional. Anyway, something needs to be done, and that's what's implicit in the first method. So we approach this recognizing that when we have these armies of negative actions, then we'd want to do something about it. The next is then that we apply bodhicitta. It says, then to purify completely the entire field of your action, like turning iron into gold, with relative bodhicitta, transform the three objects, the three poisons, and the three root merits. So the three objects, this by the way, those who have studied Lojong, you will be familiar with these expressions, three objects, three poisons, and three roots of merit. These three objects are objects that we find attractive or repulsive or just neutral. And as a consequence, we have three reactional patterns: attachment, aversion, and indifference. And transforming these, then there are potential for three roots of merit. And this is where we can transform the objects and our reactions through what we call relative bodhicitta or lojong, mind training, where we could, for example, think, may the kleshas of all beings, meaning we have a moment of attachment or aversion or whatever, may these kleshas of all beings be transformed through my present experience. That doesn't mean that we follow them, but us having them and not being caught by them, we don't resent that we have them, and we simply make an aspiration. May this be part of the solution for all sentient beings. As far as absolute bodhicitta goes, this is where we don't chase after the thoughts. We have some attachment or aversion happening, but then we don't actually get entangled in that. We look at the basis for this attachment and aversion and don't get caught by it. And the image that we have for that is the difference between a dog and a lion. See, attachment and aversion arises, we sort of get all entangled up in the object and what we really like about the object or what we don't like, and as a result we then have these kleshas. Now that's the dog's approach, and the image is we throw a stone after a dog and it barks at the dog. If you throw a stone at a lion, it doesn't actually care about the stone, it just looks around and looks who threw the stone. So we'd want to do the same with our attachment and aversion and indifference and so on. We don't really get entangled in the object, we look where it came from. So we're sort of halfway. I'm going to check if there's any questions. Okay. So the first one says, well, the first one is about absolute bodhicitta. We'll come back to that, but the question, I'll come back to that question later on. And then somebody says, is it possible for you to turn the video camera back on? I find it much easier to concentrate on what you're saying when I can see you. Well, that's very kind of you. The reason why I don't do it is actually just so that it's not too distracting. It also actually could get in the way of the text. So, but what I can do, I actually don't mind doing it while we're doing the Q&A. So I'll have it on just right now. And also I'll switch it on for the Q&A at the end. Okay, when contemplating the nature of reality and self, it seems that one of the potential dangers is to fall into a state of nihilism. Yeah, that's what I was talking about before. We're not talking about just everything of a naught, yeah? A state where all meaning, love, joy, and delight simply drain out of day-to-day life. leaving one feeling stuck or blocked or simply empty. So could you share some advice that enables me to balance between the transitory experience that makes up daily life and the ultimate emptiness of all phenomena without falling into either delusion or nihilism? Well, that's a tall order. It's a very valid question, but it's kind of the, the $64,000 question. But look, what we are talking about here is not all of a sudden fading out the object or even fading out the subject. What we're talking about here is taking off some dark specks and actually looking. And that's all what the Buddha taught. This is why we call the Buddha the awakened one. We didn't talk about the one who got it right, or the great philosopher who figured it all out, or the one who's always sort of in a state outside the world, the transcendent one, or whatever. The Buddha means someone who awoke, and it really is a bit like taking off then our blinders or our shades and actually seeing, you could say, the colors of our existence, the texture of our existence clearly. So what gets in the way of us perceiving that is this narrow-minded insecurity that clings to a self. We all notice how we actually live more freely and happier when we're not all caught up in self-consciousness or uptightness and so forth. So there's no danger of falling into either delusion or nihilism through speaking about this, you could say, wisdom that sees through the self. Why we use the word emptiness is because it's as if we think that it's so real. It's a bit like when we're watching a movie or we're having a hallucination or whatever, and somebody points out that it is just a movie, it is just a hallucination. That's where we need to understand emptiness. It's not what it appears to be. It's a paper tiger. It's a hoax. And that's where we refer to the assumption of solidity as being recognized as empty. It doesn't mean anything goes away. It just means that we're no longer stuck with this dualistic situation of self versus other. Three roots of merit are when we basically are not caught by attachment, aversion, and indifference. So that's when then the three roots of merit, they're transformed. So then in this case, we talk about the transformation. The object of attachment becomes then something that we, through relative bodhicitta, we purify through praying, may I purify my attachment, rather may I purify the attachment of all sentient beings through having this moment of this klesha. And like we talked about before, then liberating through absolute bodhicitta, simply not being caught. What is the prowess referred to in terms of taking the emotions as the path? Did we get to that yet? Well, anyway, the prowess is to just be smart. We're talking about increasing degrees of, you could say, smartness in dealing with this. So we tend to be a bit gullible, and here we're talking about 3 levels in becoming, you could say, adroit, skillful in relating to these ordinarily destructive patterns. Can we perhaps use pain as an indicator to look? Very much. We're not going to be fascinated with or objectifying pain, but yes, pain is, you could say, something that tells us that something needs to be done. Was it Buddha who observed, talked, or was it Shakyamuni? Shakyamuni and the Buddha, they're synonymous. It's the same person. So the Buddha awoke. So since then, we've been following the Buddha's example. So we talk about the Buddha as the symbolic external Buddha, the one who taught. And of course, we talk about the inner absolute Buddha, which is the Buddha nature that we are awakening. Okay, so I'll turn off the video again. It's also partly easier also for the broadband. It's less strain for the broadband, and yeah. Goodo. Finally, practicing absolute bodhicitta, realize that whatever arises is the display of Dharmakaya, the primordial nature, unbroken simplicity. Without clinging, whatever arises is naturally freed. In the great equal taste, without rejecting or accepting, continue on. The meaning, the primordial indivisibility of wisdom and skillful means, emptiness with compassion as its very essence, must be carried on to the path. So this, of course, is the scope of the great yogis. Now, relaxing back into the primordial purity of the space of reality, what we call Dhamma Dhatu. This is then the scope of the highest vipassana. This is where we talk about freedom from conceptual constructs and so forth. So, in such experience, all arising in the mind is then freed upon arising. And there's no sense of this being delusion. Everything that arises in the mind being freed, nothing ties us down. And this is then referred to as the display of the Dharmakaya. So we recognize that thoughts have never actually come into existence. And so they merely arise and dissolve into the absolute nature of mind without there ever being any assumption about them having any true reality. So with this, then thoughts naturally dissolve and they don't proliferate. At that point, we don't need any antidotes. We remain in one taste, one great equal taste. So all of this what we've been discussing here should be practiced with the unity of wisdom and compassion. So that means we integrate wisdom and we apply wisdom, what we both understand through analysis and what we also experience through settling in terms of meditation. We apply that to our clinging to the self, and that's where we then apply skillful means. And skillful means really means to integrate our phenomena, our our stuff. We bring our stuff onto the path. And then we don't just have our wisdom on one side and our experience of delusion on the other. You could say delusion and our various dispositions and so forth are brought onto the path. This we call skillful means. Particularly the supreme among all skillful means, and what we're discussing here is then compassion. And so we speak, like we did before, about this realization of emptiness endowed with a heart of compassion. So this requires then that we bring all thoughts onto the path and we bring them to liberation. Chapter 6, and this is, if you have an old edition, I have an old edition of this book from the Shechen monastery. It actually had a curious typo where it says the sublime exchange of suffering and suffering. Now it should obviously say of happiness and suffering. This we have in the newer edition. Anyway, however, to gradually gain steadiness of mind, beginners must first practice relative bodhicitta. So we generally talk about generating bodhicitta, if we look in the words of my perfect teacher, in terms of first regarding others as equal, and then exchanging with others, and then treasuring others as more important. So this is then us working with our ordinary mind. We have to be honest and we have to really address the reality, our experience. Certainly for myself, then I have tremendous clinging to a self. So here I am as a beginner, trying to study and possibly do something about this. And so this is where the gradual path that lies ahead for me is gradual you could say, development of first regarding others as equal, then you could say exchanging, basically taking their suffering and giving my own happiness, and eventually this bringing to the place where actually considering others as more important. And we have examples of that in the example of many great sages. And I think we also intuit this in the great sages that we meet, that they actually care more about others than themselves. Now, to practically go about this, we start off with, to do this, know that all sentient beings have been your mother. Ponder their kindness and think of a way to repay it. So we're connected to all beings as mothers and children. This we already discussed early on, really, in terms of how we as modern people address this, both in terms of reincarnation and also in terms of some of our, you could say, cultural practices between parent and children. This awareness enables a vast attitude of loving kindness, and we particularly train in this through pondering the kindness of our present mother, which we then extend to other beings. Rabjam Rinpoche, he says, an acute awareness of personal connection to all beings throughout many lifetimes promotes a vast sense of interdependence that will make your loving kindness practice universal and unlimited. So, practically speaking here, we are talking about pondering the kindness of our mother, all what she did for us. She gave birth to us, she looked after us when we were infants and so forth, when we were young and helpless. And reflecting on that, then, we also recognize that all sentient beings have done that. And so we extend this gratitude to all sentient beings. Develop gentle love and the rest of the four boundless qualities, especially the miraculous great compassion, meditating stage by stage upon the objects towards which these four arise very easily, relatively easily, and with difficulty. Train yourself in the four immeasurables through various methods. Since one cannot make absolute judgments, you and all beings are equal in wanting happiness. You and all beings are equal in wanting to avoid suffering. So, love and compassion, it needs to be cultivated gradually. And the love and compassion that we're talking about here is something that eventually, as we proceed, and this is again going back to where it was said before, we gradually extend this first to a few and then to more and more, first to those who are close to us, and then gradually also to include those we dislike. And eventually then our love and compassion is not just for a chosen few. We refer to these four immeasurables, and in the Theravadan tradition we refer to these as the four Brahma Viharas. We refer to these as wishing that all sentient beings, they have a happiness, and this is loving kindness. We wish that they are free from suffering, and this is compassion. Rejoicing in their happiness without jealousy is sympathetic joy, and to wish the above equally for all beings is what we call equanimity. So we would want to recognize that feelings of love and compassion, they don't come just by itself. They need to be cultivated gradually. And so we do this step by step to include more and more persons. We'd want to be very clear that when we talk about friends and enemies, this is very relative. And throughout this and many lifetimes, who has been our friends and enemies has been something that constantly changed. But we can see it even in this present lifetime. So loving kindness, it's something that overrides these relative positions based on self, on me. And again, something like in the question that came before, when we're freeing ourselves from this self-fixation. We're not destroying joy. On the contrary, we're actually beginning to discontinue what kills the joy. And we're beginning to take joy in the happiness of others. We're recognizing how others want happiness. We wish others happiness. So we want them to be free from suffering, and so on. So we cultivate these four gradually, and whatever is convenient for us. We begin with a few close persons, and then we extend it gradually. And regardless of whether people have been nice to us or not, whether they're friends or foe, they all desire happiness. They all are like us in their wishing to be free from suffering. This is what informs everybody's actions at all times, this wanting happiness. Rabjam Rinpoche says, understand that your enemy wants happiness just as you do. So we come to realize that there's no reason we should put ourselves ahead of others or make us more important. Everyone wants happiness. Rabjam Rinpoche says, having a sense of genuine equality with others will help you to put their needs ahead of your own, thereby breaking the barrier of self-centeredness. So we should be aware that meditating on loving kindness could lead to attachment. There could be some deviation on the path. We're sort of cultivating loving kindness, and then we're feeling very lovey-dovey kindness to one or two persons. And we'd want to make it real, with just recognizing how all beings wish to be free from suffering and cultivating compassion. But again, if we focus on the suffering of others, this might make us depressed. So then we can again alternate with focusing on joy, recognizing that beings occasionally have joy, and we rejoice in that without jealousy. And we extend these sentiments, these boundless meditations to all beings. So in this way, shifting back and forth, we enable ourselves to progress. In order to become used to caring for others more than yourself, you should bring to mind the essential points and integrate in your being the visualizations for exchanging self and others while riding the horse of the breath. The practice of giving happiness and taking suffering, Tonglen, it's sometimes in a modern context we have a bit of concern. Particularly, actually, mental health professionals have some concerns about this. But we'd want to appreciate that what we're doing here is reversing this counterproductive logic of the self. So we're really addressing the cause of suffering. But there are ways to deal with this if we are worried about taking others' suffering upon ourselves. But generally, what we do is inhale the suffering of others, and we exhale our own happiness. So we exchange our own happiness with the suffering of others. We exhale all our personal qualities and happiness and so forth, and the causes of happiness. We give all of this away, and we take upon ourselves then the suffering and the causes of suffering of others. So this is a very helpful meditation in terms of cultivating the four boundless. It reverses the habitual patterns that we're prone to. And we give away happiness, we take suffering. We undermine the strategies of our habitual neuroses. Now, Rabjam Rinpoche, he then suggests that if we're worried about doing that, then we could imagine a sphere of luminous light in the heart that is bodhicitta, that it possesses this courage of compassion, and simply to imagine that all the suffering of all sentient beings are gathered there as a gray mass or a dark cloud, and is purified in this sphere. One of my teachers, Jakob Rinpoche, he devised something I like to call the Tonglen light, and also this was at the request of mental health professionals, which is that you can give away your own happiness and then don't bother inhaling their suffering. This is some responses to, you could say, concern. But then again, if we look at Trungpa Rinpoche in what's it called, training the mind and cultivating loving kindness, he makes some very good arguments for we needn't worry really. Anyway, what we're basically doing is uprooting the cause of suffering and shifting around our ordinary practices, destructive and counterproductive practices. And also Rabjam Rinpoche, he describes visualization practices where we can simply visualize ourselves as a jewel, radiating benefit, thinking that we're bringing light to the world or we're emanating others that can help others. I'd like to say that in here we have some specific meditation instructions. So there I would say, above all, this is where you need to read the text and really look at the detail of the instructions there. Do not count this practice, nor measure it in terms of days, months, or years. Ask whether true experience has been born within or not, and be sincere in making bodhicitta an all-embracing, profound, integral part of yourself. So we need to practice this with some honesty, and we need to cultivate this without limiting our work with bodhicitta to the time that we're practicing, the quantity, whatever. This is about something that is about our life. It's beyond formal meditation, and this is the only way really that we could have realization of bodhicitta. It extends beyond meditation and post-meditation. So it has to be integrated in all aspects of life, and particularly we need to look if we're still prone to the same habitual patterns as we were before. Rabjam Rinpoche, he says we should cultivate this bodhicitta until loving kindness, bodhicitta, compassion become our second nature. Just like an experienced horse rider, equestrian, can take all the obstacles on a course without falling off the horse. And he also quotes His Holiness Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who would say, "It's not when things go well that you can judge a true practitioner, but when adverse circumstances arise, then you can clearly see the shortcomings of the practice." So we need to make this lojong, mind training, this training in bodhicitta, an integral part of ourselves. So we're not overwhelmed under changing circumstances, and we should regularly check how we're doing. In order to weaken whatever contradicts this practice and to strengthen whatever assists it, you should, by the utmost of your ability, purify your obscurations, perfect the accumulations, and pray repeatedly to the Guru and the Three Jewels, putting all your hopes in them. Now this is how we enhance the practice. We want to understand the value of accumulation of merit, dedication and rejoicing, and these are the skillful means then that you can say address our habitual patterns. If we don't have these skillful means, then the journey could be very long. So Rabjam Rinpoche says, for example, apply the benefits of positive practices such as making offerings, performing prostrations and circumambulations, and reciting mantras to a larger goal than your own limited selfish purposes. So in this way, if we focus on the path just as something for ourselves, then of course it has some benefit. But if we see its relevance for all beings and we dedicate it to others, then it has a far more powerful impact. And this is where we should be very proactive then in essentially the two aspects of what we call accumulating merit and purifying obscurations. So we seal that with dedication, and we dedicate to others happiness and liberation, and we also take the opportunity then to make aspirations that bodhicitta may increase. And we should look at those who actually embody bodhicitta, the lives and examples of great teachers and sages. And we should look at them rather than the example of others. And learning from them, we then do practices such as praying to the three jewels, praying to the guru, and so on. This is a way of integrating their example. When your own happiness increases, or when you simply have desire for it, you must understand that virtuous deeds lead to happiness. Therefore, at all times, gather your energy and generously dedicate it to all sentient beings, praying that your happiness and virtuous deeds may nurture all beings. So, happiness and suffering, they don't just happen. They don't come about through random chance. In Buddhism, we neither accept random chance nor fate. Things happen as a result of causes and conditions. So we rejoice when happiness happens, and we see this as a manifestation of the good causes. And also we recognize suffering as without resentment. We realize this is the result of some actions that were the causes of these suffering. It's not about punishment or you could say ill will from the universe. This is just our actions. Then again, sometimes we have a positive take on it. In Tibetan we say dikchang, which means essentially purifying negative actions. So sometimes we could take suffering that comes as something that is purifying negative actions. Some people call it clearing karma. Anyway, when you see others acting virtuously, rejoice from your heart without animosity or jealousy, and pray that everyone may act likewise. So we see others are doing well, so we're happy about that, and we're in being happy about it, rejoicing. We actually create the conditions for sharing in that merit. We basically have a choice when we see others doing something wonderful. We could sort of say, "Oh, they're doing it, and I'm not," and we resent that we don't have the opportunity. You know, we're not at the important event with the teacher or whatever, and we might have jealousy. Or we could actually just think, wow, this is really wonderful, this is happening, and be happy for others. See, if we resent, if we're jealous, this just plants seeds for further disturbing conditions, further suffering. And if we rejoice, like I said before, we share the merit. So it's really valuable that we appreciate the happiness and virtue of others. Okay, time for, I'm going a little bit over time, but just have a check, see if there's any questions. It seems that the machinations of the ego can be very subtle. How do we see this enemy more consistently? The Tibetan word is Shechen, or the Padmakara people call it introspection. I think in Nalanda they call it awareness. And it's simply just knowing what's going on inside ourselves. So we just know. We might not be habituated to looking at what's going on inside ourselves, and this, of course, is what we train in. But we are continually what we call the number one witness to what's going on. So we gradually become more and more aware of the subtle games of the ego. This doesn't necessarily, it's not particularly, how do you say, self-involved or self-conscious. This is more actually calling a spade, and it also doesn't mean necessarily that we're caught up in it. In fact, the less we're caught up in it, the more honest actually we can be about it. Should we wish others happiness irrelevantly from the way they define happiness? Absolutely. However they might define happiness, we just want them to be happy. So actually we obviously want them to not be. Some people might find it really wonderful to get, how do you say, to be on drugs or do things that we know are destructive. But as far as our wishing their happiness, we actually don't really judge. Of course, we at the same time should have the wisdom to remove the cause of suffering, but it's not always that we have the liberty to do that. We might not be asked. So at the end of the day, the wishing others happiness, it's really regardless of how they get it. You could say any happiness in samsara that is based on a self is by nature delusional. So as far as samsara goes, then there's no way around happiness always being caught up in clinging to a self. So there's always, you could say, destructive happiness happening. So yeah, the simple way is just to be wishing them happiness. Difference between compassion, great compassion, and bodhicitta. For all practical purposes, we can say they're pretty synonymous. Compassion and great compassion here is the same. We sometimes talk about the highest of compassion, which is what we call non-referential compassion or objectless compassion, which is synonymous with emptiness. But that's not necessarily what we've been discussing here. So we're just talking about conventional compassion, the wish to be that others are free from suffering. And bodhicitta is, as we saw, it can be relative bodhicitta, it can be absolute bodhicitta. And that is, relative bodhicitta is compassion with an object. Absolute bodhicitta is compassion without an object. Taking on others' suffering has overwhelmed me in the past. Very draining. How can I practice this and not die? No, we sometimes get tangled up in others' suffering. That's very different. Here we're not talking about getting tangled up. That is indeed, tangled up is very draining. So when we're talking about Tonglen practice, we're talking about wishing that they're happy. And we're simply just wanting them to be happy, and we give them our happiness. We take their suffering. But we're not necessarily engaging in the whole thing on the premises of our confusion and their confusion. Practicing prostration, is this Nundro? Yeah, it's part of Nundro. It's a very common practice that goes with, you could say, devotion, goes with respect and so forth. So in fact, in Buddhist cultures everywhere, it's something that you practice. Why did Mapa manifest to cry? Yeah, this is when Mapa's son died. We famously have says this is the illusion of illusion or super illusion. If Mapa treated this as an illusion, why did he cry? But if he didn't cry, it seemed that he was not a human. So, right. Well, look, famously, Kyabje Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, he had to carry his own daughter in the early 60s, had to carry his own daughter down to the Yamuna River and burn her there. I'm sure Khyentse Rinpoche would have been profoundly distressed. So I would say that it might appear differently to different beings, really depending on how we're perceiving Mapa. So it's hard to say. Personally, I would be reluctant to speculate what really was going on with Mapa. I know Trungpa Rinpoche, he talks about this somewhere. He refers to Mapa's illusion as it being a super illusion and explaining it. But essentially, it's difficult for us to actually judge sublime beings and why they're doing as they're doing. But we would generally say that everything that a sublime being does is a teaching to us. Is Shechen also clear seeing, or is that something else? Shechen is together with Drenpa, together with mindfulness, then mindfulness and awareness together work as part of the path. So we work with both mindfulness, which is being present, and awareness that knows when we're present and when we're not present. So it's part of the practice of meditation. Rinpoche is not for happiness against wishing others. Rinpoche is not for happiness against wishing others happiness. How do we understand it, or different both? What? Rinpoche is not for happiness against wishing others happiness. How do we understand it or differentiate both? I don't really understand the formulation of the question. Rinpoche's book, Not for Happiness, gets its name from the fact that very often nowadays we sort of have the mindfulness is hijacked, and a lot of spirituality is hijacked for the purpose of essentially securing the happiness of the self. And the Buddha's enlightenment goes beyond the self. It goes beyond just the narrow scope of personal happiness. Okay, I'd like to thank you for joining. There's one more question coming in here. On one hand, we recognize all happiness and suffering is a result of cause and effect. So all arising is spontaneously perfect. All causality is non-duality. How do you see the ultimate and relative? Yeah, no, it's true. The relative truth operates on the conditions of cause and effect. The absolute is beyond cause and effect. So that's essentially the difference between ultimate and relative truth. So you could say the path is all about creating the right conditions, but it leads to enlightenment, which is beyond conditions altogether. Otherwise, of course, enlightenment would be, if enlightenment was caused, then it would just be a product. It would be impermanent. Okay, so I think at this point we'll then dedicate the merit. Oh yeah. For next time, then we read chapters 7 and 8. So by this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you very much.